We've sort of hit the 12:02 mark, which is licensed to start. Hello, everybody. I'm David Barrell. I'm the executive director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, your host today, along with a couple of colleagues, Emma and Hong Yi. This is the first speaker of the fall series. We're very happy to have Catherine Thomas with us. She's Associate Professor of Managerial Economics and Strategy at the London School of Economics. She has crafted a paper with Chris Stanton of HBS on the topic of online gig economy platforms, and not surprisingly, her research focuses on how firms engage in offshoring, how firms make outsourcing decisions, and the performance consequences of firms' organizational structures. Really important part of our economy. We're very happy to have Catherine here today to talk about her paper. Just a few logistics before we get started. If you're going to be jumping around doing calisthenics, then please put your video on pause. Also, if you wouldn't mind going on mute. Catherine has said that she's happy to be interrupted if there's a clarifying question or something that she says is egregious, or at least you think so. But otherwise, please feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go. And then Emma and Hong Yi and/or I will curate them at the end of the talk. But this is an informal session, so I hope you'll treat it as such. And Catherine, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David, and thanks very much to you and the other organizers for this invitation. I'm really happy to have a chance to present my work here. As David said, this is a joint work with Chris Stanton at HBS, and it's part of a long-standing research agenda that we've had, for a few years now, working with administrative data from a large, well-known online labor market that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. I know some of your colleagues are very familiar with it, so I think this is a research site that will be you already know quite a lot about it. The specific question that we are asking today is, where is the surplus, and how much surplus is being generated in this market, and how is this surplus being distributed? So by way of motivation, let me just establish a few starting points. So I think recent work has shown that upwards of 160 million workers are supplying some form of labor services to online labor market platforms. And this is work that's been done by the Oxford Internet Institute. They scrape their various markets and aggregate up the numbers. Now, this is the number of workers that have profiles on these sites. It's actually a smaller fraction that are actually actively supplying labor at any one point in time, but a lot of people are participating in this marketplace, in these marketplaces on the supply side. And what is common across these different marketplaces is that they are places where suppliers of work can meet potential buyers of remote work, and the output is delivered electronically. So what the output has in common is that it's things that can be done digitally, remotely, communicated via email or via some kind of other digital means. And it's typically short-term task-based work. And as such, as sort of part of the gig economy that has seen such much discussed recent growth, part of the growth of alternative work arrangements. And there's been a lot of work discussing the implications of these marketplaces for how we think about labor and how we ensure that both sides of the market are adequately protected within these settings. Now, there's been quite a lot of work thinking about often the supply side. We know that workers in these settings value the flexibility that gig-based work offers, but also we are concerned about the income insecurity that comes along with that. As such, of course, there's lots of current debate about how best to think about these markets and approach them in a regulatory setting. What we do in this paper is use data from a large online market to try and answer 3 questions that we think are relevant to this debate about how to think about regulating these kind of markets. We're going to quantify surplus and look at how it's distributed, and along the way use our model that we estimate to address 3 questions. First of all, what is the surplus? How much are workers are getting and how much are buyers getting? And moreover, how is it distributed amongst workers in the platform? And what would happen in this platform if we were to apply various types of labour market regulation? And what we do at the moment is sort of a fairly broad brush approach where we take some of the sort of basic premises of labour market regulation in traditional employment and just apply it in this marketplace, and then simulate both how the supply side and the demand side would respond and what happens to the surplus as a consequence. And then the third question that we address is coming from the data that we have. It's outside our model, but we take advantage of the timing of our data, which spans a sort of natural experiment where offline minimum wages increased during our data set in a subset of US states. And we can look to see at what happened to labour demand, whether employers seem to switch towards hiring in our labour market around this time. And we use that to try and infer something about the substitutability from the demand side for labour services online and traditional employment offline. And we try and sort of measure that elasticity. And just as a preview of the findings, the dollar number that we have from the time when our data spans, which is now quite old in the platform, it's a 30-month period from 2008 to 2010. And we estimate that every hour worked generated an average of $5.50 in surplus, and that as much as a third, in fact, slightly over a third of this surplus was going to the workers that were hired. Now, as I mentioned already, it's only a fraction of workers that are actually hired. So we make some adjustments to try and sort of net out the application costs of unsuccessful applicants, and we still find a positive surplus for the workers. On the second question, we apply these sort of counterfactual scenarios. We apply a minimum wage, and we apply a 10% tax. And we find that under either of those counterfactuals, the surplus generated in the market falls a lot. Why does it fall a lot? We have some interesting margins of adjustment. And what we see is that while hiring on posted jobs does fall, what really changes is the dynamics of how buyers use this platform. So what we see in our data is that people who are trying out this market, deciding whether to hire somebody or not at first, those that have good experiences and for whom the platform works really well, come back much more often, post more jobs, hire more often. And our data on the dynamics of how this evolves shows that if you are sort of hit with high hiring costs early on, that transition to learning that the site works for you, becoming experienced, starting to be one of those buyers that posts a lot and hires a lot, is really reduced, which shrinks the size of the overall market. So we find it's that margin of adjustment, the number of jobs that are posted, that falls over time, which given that workers are getting surplus from when they are hired only, ends up shrinking the surplus to both parties. And then we ask whether the surplus that we find is perhaps to some extent arising at the expense of surplus that would be generated otherwise in offline settings. And we can't find any evidence that the buyers on this platform consider online and offline to be very close substitutes. So we see that as a good news story, that whilst the surplus is being generated there, it's not coming at the cost of offline employment opportunities. This question is very much open for discussion, and we're continuing to do some work on that. So very happy to hear any thoughts that you have on that when we get there. Okay, so let me just say a few more things that just to set the scene. This obviously a lot of recent debate about what this type of way of working actually means for the people involved in the markets, and concerns about how to ensure that workers in the gig-based economy are somehow compensated for the insecurity of the income stream in various ways. And there's coming in particular from Assembly Bill 5 in California in 2019, a lot of obviously legal discussion about what it is that actually constitutes an employee. There's currently various exceptions for ride-sharing apps, delivery companies, but very much a sort of hot topic as to what these new regulations will mean for companies operating in various ways, shapes, and various forms in the gig economy. And it's not just a US phenomenon. The EU has an equivalent set of laws or a similar set of laws that are being produced. And then other legislation that Biden is a big fan of, the PRO Act, which is allowing workers to organize more formally, also may have the implication of enabling more supply-side organization within groups of gig economy workers. So I think for now it's pretty clear that the labor market platforms that we study in this particular paper are exempt from falling into the category of, for how these laws classify employment rather than contract work. A lot of it is because in the labor market platforms that we have studied here, the workers have the opportunity to select their own wages. And that turns out to be an important part of the way that the market works. But nonetheless, it's out there and it's in the environment, and it's something that it's helpful to think through what the implications of this kind of regulatory change may have on these types of markets. Okay. Got a couple of questions in the chat already. Shall I have a look there, or?
I think maybe you should try to ignore them, but if they're too tempting, feel free to go.
Let me take a.
Maybe the first one about do your results vary by sector would be.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the data, because we've got we're only looking at one platform, I should say, just to be clear, but we do have a lot of data, so we know exactly what the worker skill sets are and what tasks they are applying to do. So we do have some interesting differences as we go through. In particular, we focus on the difference between very technical work, coding, software development, that sort of thing, versus non-technical work, data entry, administrative support. We make these distinctions for various reasons. One is that the worker profiles are very different. They come from a different set of countries, and they obviously have very different hourly wages. So we have that information, and we do try and think about how it matters for the estimates. I had the results vary. I'm going to present only the average results, I'm afraid, but in the paper there's some differences by sector. In fact, in the paper we plot out the distributions of worker surplus by country, And a lot of the variation by country is driven by differences in the activity. So we see workers from the Philippines and Bangladesh doing mostly data entry and administrative support. The distribution of the hourly surplus that those workers receive has a lower mean and is shifted to the left altogether than the workers from, say, Russia and actually from India, even though India is a low-wage country, because the workers are doing a higher a set of jobs that require higher skills. The wage distribution, the surplus distribution, is shifted to the right. I'll spend some time on that, I think. Do we have a mechanism for learning and calculating whether or not bias? The disintermediation issue. Now, yeah, so this is interesting. So related to what we were talking about just before the presentation, the way that this platform works is that the platform takes 10% of all revenues in the way of fees. And so once a successful relationship has been established, there is a strong incentive on both sides to disintermediate and start to contract off the platform. And I think this has been, for a long time, one of the challenges that the platform is worried about. Now, to this question of do we observe it, we don't observe it. I think there has been some work done by Feng Zhu at HBS, I think some others, looking at trying to detect it. So, when we see a very successful relationship that suddenly disappears and neither party kind of comes back and tries to recontract with someone else, how often does that happen, and what types of matches is that happening? We've narrowed our samples to only matches that are not repeat contracts actually in our data. I'll try and have a think about what the implications of that are as I get to the results. And just as an aside, what the platform does is really emphasize the on-the-job work management tools that it provides, so that the payment systems, the ability to communicate, exchange screenshots, all this sort of stuff, as adding value while the work is actually being done to discourage exactly this kind of activity. Okay, so I've got a couple more sort of setup slides just to position our research question. So a lot of people have focused on the supply side trade-off between flexibility and income insecurity. What we think has been sort of relatively understudied has been the fact that the buyers of labor services in these markets are also very heterogeneous and have very heterogeneous preferences. And we see that in the data. There's a lot of variation in engagement. Some people come very often, some people hire multiple people concurrently for different jobs. And the flexibility on the demand side seems to be something that is an important characteristic of for the participants of this market, and also something that really is quite different from the act of hiring someone in an offline traditional employment relationship. And we want to have in our model the ability to capture some of this heterogeneity of engagement, and also see how important that is in terms of value. So I've put up this screenshot here, which we just captured from the market, and it's highlighting, on the front page to the people thinking of hiring on this site that, we are here to provide flexibly the kind of labor input that you need. Okay, right. So our platform is the largest global online labor market. And if you are wanting to hire someone on this site, it's very easy to do so. You simply create a profile as a potential buyer. You provide some information about yourself, don't really need to do that much. And then you can go straight to posting a job. You give your job a title. This job posting here is data entry and validation. You give a few pieces of information about the job. It's very short term, less than 1 month, 30 hours a week. These are the kind of skills you might need: some data mining, Excel skills. Write a short job description, and then you post the job, and then you sit back and you wait for applications to arrive. You can also search the applicants, but that doesn't happen quite so much actually in the time of our data. Most people sit back and wait for the workers to apply. And so over here, some summary information about the employer is available to the workers, in particular, how experienced they are, how experienced the buyer is on the platform, whether they've hired people before. Then your applications come in, and as a potential hirer on the platform, I see quite a lot of information about the people I can employ, or people I can hire for my task. Here, because this is a data entry task, a lot of the applications we got were from people based in the Philippines and in other countries where there is a lot of data entry and this kind of work. We see information about them, their feedback that they've received on prior work, how much prior work they've done, a little bit about themselves. I can click on any of these and find out a lot more information. And importantly, I see this $3.33, which is the hourly rate at which Therese is willing to work on my job. Now, all of these two examples here, they both bid $3.33, which at the time when we took this screenshot was the lowest hourly wage they could bid, because it was after the $3 minimum wage was introduced in this platform, and it was $3.33 because the platform takes 10% of the revenues. So here's my opportunity to explain, a bit more how the platform makes its money, and that the workers are actually choosing their wage rate. If we went further down the list, we would see workers submitting higher wage bids, which would be the wage at which they were willing to work at. So in our data, which, as I mentioned, spans 30 months between 2008 and 2010, we've got sort of career experience of over 67,000 buyers or potential buyers, who between them post nearly 170,000 job vacancies, and they receive 4.5 million job applications from a collective 192,000 workers, labour service providers. Some summary statistics about these buyers. The majority are in high wage countries in the US or in another G10 country. So that the entire rationale for the platform is wage arbitrage. There are lots of very skilled workers willing to supply this type of labor based in low wage countries, and there are lots of potential buyers in high wage countries who are willing to find it valuable to hire these workers. I put in here very few buyers are in India or the Philippines, which are, as well as the US, India and Philippines are the most frequently observed countries of the providers of work. Now, of these buyers, about 57% have their first job posting in a technical job category, which, as I said, is software development, web design, etc. And we see over the course of their involvement with the platform, sometimes they stay in tech, sometimes they move to other job categories. There's quite a lot of movement around. And these buyers, on average, post 2.5 jobs over the data period, and there's a really large standard deviation. So just to highlight, some people post one job, don't like it, never hire, never come back. Some really like it, post one job, have a great experience, start posting very, very frequently. Some summary statistics about the openings. So the 3 columns in this table, the first column is across all openings, all 170,000 openings. And then the first column after that, this one in the middle, 0 prior hires, is what people do the first time they post, or all of the postings that they make before they actually get around to hiring somebody. And then the last column is another subset, which is the jobs that are posted when the buyer already has hired at least 3 times, so have made at least 3 prior hires. And the reason I separated them out is you see there on some dimensions, the vacancies start to look different. So on the whole, vacancies are posted by buyers who post a vacancy sort of every 1.15 months. But for those who haven't hired, they post less frequently. For those that have hired before, they have started to post more frequently on average. The number of applicants doesn't really change too much. Those who have not hired before, those vacancies tend to get slightly fewer applicants, but not too much less. The mean wage bid actually varies in interesting ways. It's not a big difference, but it's an interesting one in that the average wage bid is $10.88. So, I mean, actually that first of all makes it clear that the data entry jobs I showed on the previous slide are by no means the only thing going on. In fact, the average wage bid is $10 an hour. So there are these sort of technical job categories where the wage bids are coming in quite high. And on average, vacancies when the buyer has not posted before get slightly higher wage bids than the bids to the very experienced. This next line, it's relevant because one of the counterfactuals we do is introduce a $7 minimum wage. Across all openings, it's pretty similar. Around 1/3 of the applications, the wage bid is below $7. Okay, and that's pretty constant across the experience levels of the buyers. And then this last row is the probability of hiring, and this one varies in interesting ways. So on average, only 1/5 of jobs are actually filled on the platform. So 1 in 5 jobs are actually a hire is made. For the buyers who have not hired before, that probability is lower, it's at 15%. And for those that have hired previously, it's at 25%. So the two things that I think are the most sort of salient from this table are to pull out that the buyers who've had experience, they post more often, and they're also more likely to hire. These are the kind of differences in the way that buyers behave that we want our model to be able to capture, so that we kind of get all of the biodynamics that are relevant for the surplus that's being generated. Okay, so that's a sort of, that finishes my sort of summary, stats and setup. The next section of the talk moves to estimating the model of this market that we're going to use to estimate surplus and then use to run the counterfactuals. And this is sort of the bulk of the talk, and I've divided it into 6 parts. And I'm going to briefly talk through each of the parts. Those of you who are interested in the details of the estimation or the structure, please do send me an email, or we discuss now or at the end, and or I can send you the paper and we can discuss further. But the building blocks sort of, hopefully it'll be clear how they all fit together and do what we want it to do. So what's the purpose of this model? Well, we want to understand what's driving the behavior of the supply side and the demand side, and we're going to build in a sort of a structure that we think captures the salient features about how each side of the market is behaving. We're going to use the data that we've got from the platform to parameterize that model, and then we're going to use that later to change certain things, put in the restriction of the minimum wage, put in the extra tax that we do in our other counterfactual, and then see how both sides of the market respond. So it's very important that we sort of capture the most important aspects of the behavior of both the workers and the buyers. So that's what these first few sections are. So first of all, I'm going to think about how a buyer, having posted a job, thinks about whom to hire out of the applications that they receive, or not hire anybody. The second second aspect is we're going to think about how the buyers decide whether to post a job or not in a certain time period, and what factors influence that posting frequency. Sorry, that's down here, that's down here. Before we get there, we're going to look at the how workers decide what bids to submit to the jobs that are posted. So the buyers post the jobs, a worker sees a job ad like the one that I showed and has to think about whether or not it's for them or not. And then if it's for them, how do they decide their optimal wage? And we let their bid be a function of their costs and an optimal markup given the extent of market power that they think that they have in this particular vacancy. Because we want to estimate these demand elasticities, which play a role in the hiring decision and also the bid decision, we need an identification strategy. We observe a lot about the workers, but perhaps there's something unobserved about their appeal to buyers that is correlated with their wage bids. We have two instruments that I'll spend some time talking about. So that all happens. Then we've got the vacancy posting decisions, which is how buyers decide how frequently to post jobs. A little bit on the estimation, which is a maximum likelihood estimation over the sequence of buyers posted jobs and hiring decisions. And then how we use our estimates to calculate surplus. There's 6 parts, so let me go through those quite quickly. Okay. Okay. I'm just already looking at the time, and I think I do want to go through it very quickly because I definitely want to get to the results and how we're going to use these estimates. So let me just start with see how I go, and I might speed up and cut through to the most interesting parts. It's all about buyer heterogeneity. So we want buyers' hiring decisions to be rich enough to reflect different sources of differences across the buyers. So what we do is we allow them to have different types, and it's basically going to be the type that really likes the platform and the type that doesn't like the platform. And we're going to also allow their hiring decisions to vary with how much hiring experience they've got, based on what we saw in the summary statistics. They post a job on an opening, call that opening O. They get a set of applications from a set of JIO workers. Each of those applications contains a lot of information about the workers, where they're from, what their experience is, what their feedback is, all that sort of stuff, and the order in which they applied for the job, which turns out to be important. The people who applied early on are much more likely to be hired. And also their wage bid, and then we have an unobserved term. And then we also say, they are choosing possibly the outside option of not hiring at all. If we assume that each of these options has an unobserved value to the employer, we are willing to say that those unobserved values are draws from an extreme value distribution, then we can write down the probability that any one choice gives the highest indirect utility to the buyer. And that choice, that probability can be matched to what we see in the data about the 0-1 outcome of whether that worker is the person that is hired. So the hiring probability, conditional on the buyer's unobserved to us type K, which we're going to estimate, and past experience in the platform chi, is going to be a function of the worker characteristics of across all of the applications that they get and all of the wage bids. And we put it as a sort of conditional logit type of model where we match the expected utility, a function of the observed characteristics and the wage, to the outcomes of the 0-1 outcomes of whether or not that worker is hired. And that information allows us to infer how much value the employer puts on the characteristics of different types, the bias, the worker's feedback, the worker's country of origin, how much they seem to value the application being one of the first ones that they see, and how much they dislike the wage, their disutility for paying a high hourly wage. We also in there have this term mu, which is going to be a term that captures each buyer's average value for hiring on the platform versus the outside option. And this mu is unobserved, but we're going to estimate a distribution of mu's. And that's just a source of buyer heterogeneity that we're calling buyer type. Okay, bidding behavior. We assume that a worker sees a job ad, has some sense about how competitive this job is, has some sense about the buyer's willingness to pay for their individual skills on this particular opening, and submits a bid, which is their cost plus an optimal markup. And we borrow tools from IO. We conceive of the workers as differentiated products who are basically setting prices in an oligopoly setting. And we can use that to write down an expression for the wage bid that the worker submits, which is a function of their individual costs, which can vary with the buyer's experience, can vary with the characteristics of the job, a parameter tau, which is the fee that the platform takes. That's just a fixed 10% over the time period of our data. And then this optimal markup term, which consists of the probability that this worker is hired, plus the responsiveness, divided by the responsiveness of that probability to the wage bid. So this is the semi-elasticity bid. If the worker perceives that they have a lot of market power, for example, because they're one of the early applicants, they end up, the probability of being hired is very unresponsive to their wage bid, and they end up submitting a higher wage bid. So that's going to show up as a higher markup for the worker. Now that's interesting for us, because if the worker, if this markup term here was 0, so the worker was just bidding their cost plus the platform fees, there's no channel for the worker to get any surplus whatsoever, because they are just, even if they're hired, they're getting their wage, which is equal to their marginal cost. So in order for us to kind of allow for the possibility for this market to be not perfectly competitive, such that all of the rents for the workers are competed away, we want there to be this endogenous markup term, which we're going to estimate. Okay, rearranging this expression here gives us the costs, which is the wage plus the divided by the markup. Okay, identification. Let me spend a few minutes talking about this. We know a lot about the workers. We don't observe everything. We instrument for their wage bids based on 2 instruments that we get from the timing of the data. The first comes from the fact that most of these workers are located outside of the US, and therefore are likely to have off-platform alternative work opportunities that are denominated in their local currency. But the currency of this platform globally is the US dollar, and the dollar bids that they have to submit are all in US dollars. So we think that these workers are playing a game of, when I submit my bid, I'm kind of trying to figure out the exchange rate and how this relates to my local compensation. And what we actually see is that the first stage is very strong, is that if, let's say, the Indian rupee appreciates against the dollar such that the Indian rupee is worth more, then workers in India, on average, push up their bids on the platform. And we think that that's exogenous to any one worker's unobservable characteristics that affects the buyer's demand for their services. So that first stage works quite well. It doesn't work for us for the workers who are in the US and whose currency is denominated in dollars. And in particular, it doesn't help us pin down their wage bid variation relative to the outside option, which is also in dollars. So we have a second instrument, which is based on the perceived competition on jobs. So we take very similar jobs in the same week, and we look for arguably exogenous variation, the total number of applications to those jobs. And it does vary. And we see that that first stage also works such that if very similar jobs have a high number of applicants, that week, then actually the workers bidding to any one similar job end up bidding lower bids. So that first stage works as well. And I've got a couple of slides now. Here's an illustration of the exchange rate instrument. The red circles are the dollar rupee exchange rate, which varies by month over the timing of our data. It starts quite high and then falls and then rises again. The blue squares are the residualized wage bids from people based in India. And there's enough correlation to serve as a pretty decent first stage. There's a table in the paper where we just established that those instruments work in the direction that we would like. Rupee appreciates, workers in India bid more. We've got positive coefficients across the board there. Jobs get more competitive, workers bid less, negative coefficients across the board there. The magnitude of this of these first stage coefficients doesn't vary with whether or not the buyer is experienced very much. Also not very sensitive to whether we include additional controls, such as the number of applications that the worker is making in a month or not. We have some issue, and actually this relates to some of John Horton's work, that we might be concerned about selection on the instrument. So when, for example, the exchange rate moves, a non-random subset of workers decide not to apply at all. And we have some robustness tests in the paper where we try and see how vulnerable our first stage is to that selection. And we overall conclude it may be slightly vulnerable, but we still feel that we're picking up some exogenous variation. Next part of the model is the vacancy posting decisions. We model this in reduced form. How often does a buyer post a job? We allow that posting rate to be some constant, which we call delta 1. We allow it to then vary with whether that buyer has previous hiring experience, and our hiring experience is measured by the parameter chi. If chi is positive, they've hired before, we allow that to influence their hiring frequency, their posting frequency. We also have allow it to vary with a third factor, which is the wage bids that they've received in the past. So if they happen to have posted jobs in the past where there has been sort of some exogenous reason why wage bids were high that week or low that week, we see if their future hiring frequency is related to variation they've received in the past. And this channel turns out to be quite important, because under our well, first of all, the coefficient is negative and significant. If you've received higher wage bids in the past, you tend to post less. And then in our counterfactuals, because the counterfactuals have the effect of increasing the wage bids that buyers receive, we show that this has this impact of reducing their future posting, and it's this parameter that does that in our model. Okay, having written down the model for the hiring decisions, the posting frequency, we write down as a function of all of those parameters how likely we are to see a given set of job postings and then a given set of hires for each buyer over the 30 months that we observed the buyers for on the data. And we estimate the whole thing via maximum likelihood. The instruments we include in a control function in the hiring probability. What else to say? Oh yes, how do we identify mu, which is the buyer types? The buyer type is this parameter that allows some buyers to really like the platform, some buyers do not like it very much, some to post very often, some to not post very often. And we estimate a distribution by saying, okay, let's just suppose there are 3 types of buyers. Let's see over the whole population what the probability distribution is over those types. How many of each type are there? And we use the data to give us the parameters of that distribution. But the intuition is, if we see people that are hiring all the time, despite getting very poor quality applicants, then they would have a high value for the platform. But if other posters receive great sets of applicants based on all of the observable characteristics, but then those buyers never hire, then we say, well, they must have a low average value for hiring anyone on the platform relative to not hiring. And that's what pins that down. Okay, surplus calculation. I'm not going to spend much time on this at all. There's various ways we approach estimating the surplus, but broadly speaking, for the buyers, we calculate their willingness to pay based on their expected utility. And then we see what price they have to pay, what wages they have to pay. We integrate up the area under the demand function, and that's the surplus to the buyers. And then we do some, we do that at the level of a posting, at the level of a hire, at a level of a posting, and then we sort of look over the number of postings that they do over the time period and then discount it, and that's how we get our buyer surplus. There's some interesting sort of dynamics about the fact that when you're calculating a surplus for an inexperienced buyer, with some probability they will become experienced. So we have to account for that as well. Surplus calculations on the supply side. This one's quite straightforward. I think if you could remember equation 2, which of course there's no reason for you to remember that, but equation 2 was the equation that said that the wages are the cost plus a markup. Because we observe the wage bids and we can use the demand elasticities to estimate the optimal markup, we can back out the costs, and that allows us to basically look at the difference between the wages and the costs, i.e. the surplus for each worker who's making a bid. We can figure it out for those that are hired, multiply it by the probability of being hired, which is quite small, to give us the expected surplus of applying, and then aggregate it up over all of the hours that are worked and all of the applications that are made, and we adjust for the costs of the unsuccessful applicants. Okay, I've got some results. I'm looking at my I'm looking at the time here. I think I'm getting close to the time where we're supposed to be stopping for the Q&A. So
we can do Q&A in maybe 6 or 7 minutes, and I think since you've answered questions I would push it as much as
at the beginning with the whole motivation, but let me give you the key things here. The types are very skewed. We've got a lot of a type, which we call type 1, which doesn't seem to like the platform very much. Experiments, doesn't hire, maybe hires once, doesn't come back. We've got a very small fraction of buyers who really end up really liking the platform, hiring a lot, and they have a really disproportionately large number of the overall postings. Buyers dislike high bids, that's the coefficient on the wage bids. How the types really vary, as I mentioned, is in how often they post jobs. Okay, some demand elasticities and the surpluses. Okay, so when we find the difference between the willingness to pay coming from the expected utility and the prices, the wages that the buyers have to pay, and we do oral adjustments to aggregate up over all of the average out over all the types of jobs and things and all the types of buyers, we come up with an estimate of the surplus per hour on a filled job of being $3.65 for a buyer. Now, bear in mind the sort of average wage paid is about $10, so that's quite a lot of surplus for the buyers. We've got these elasticities that are sensible. I won't talk too much about that. Now, the thing is, though, that when you're talking about the surplus of the overall platform, we have to adjust for the fact that on a lot of jobs, a hire isn't made. So we can figure out the expected utility and the expected surplus of posting a job by adjusting for the hiring probability on each one. And we see that the surplus from posting a job is about somewhere between 50 cents and 75 cents per hour. When we aggregate that up over all of the expected postings for each buyer over the 30 months, we get these figures of $306 for a person who's starting out as an inexperienced, and then this huge figure of $3,800 for the average buyer with experience using this platform. And that's really driven by these type 2s who have a really frequent job posting and high hiring probability. Here's the the interesting bit, the surplus for workers. We see that they get an average of $1.89 when hired. But the thing is, for the workers, right, there's on average 20 to 30 applications per job, and on average only 20% of jobs are filled. So there's a lot of applications that aren't successful. And when you adjust those surplus numbers to take into account the low probability of being hired, the surplus from applying is actually quite low. But what the surplus from applying does depend on is your applicant order. It turns out that the early applicants, they submit higher wage bids, they have higher markups, and they're still much more likely to be hired. It's because buyers really only seem to look at the applicants that they see in the first 1 to 10 people. And we can work out the supply side lifetime surplus as well. Okay, 2 sentences on the counterfactuals. We introduced a minimum wage of $7 per hour, and we introduce a tax of an additional 10% an hour. They work differently because the minimum wage only affects first order, the people who would otherwise be bidding below $7, although everybody re-optimizes their wage once that floor is introduced. The 10% tax is applied across the board, so all workers shift up their wages. If I had more time, and maybe in the Q&A I can do this, I wanted to compare our sort of structural imposition of a minimum wage to what John Horton does in his paper, where they actually introduced the minimum wage, this $3 minimum wage, before it came in. We find stuff that's quite complementary to him, but because he had this very careful experiment where the postings had already been made and people had already been bid, and he just asked them to revise their bid upwards if they were below $3. What we're able to sort of do in addition to that is look at the posting frequency, so look at how buyers are affected in the future from the higher wage bids they've received in the past, and that turns out to be important. The bottom line of our counterfactuals is that we find far fewer jobs are posted. So the blue line is the cumulative number of jobs posted in the data. The orange line is the predicted number of postings in the data under the estimates of our model. So the orange line is how well our model fits the actual data, which is the blue line. Under the counterfactuals, the number of jobs falls to this yellow dotted line. So you can see there's just a big jump downwards. It's just fewer jobs being posted. Online, offline substitution. We look at, just going to skip straight to the graph. We see what happens on the platform when, in the middle of 2009, all but 10 states raised the federal minimum wage to $7.25, which is why we chose the $7 counterfactual. And we look in states that are affected versus unaffected by that minimum wage rise, and we don't really see any differential effect. We don't see any differential effect. The test is whether the blue line looks different to the red line around this event and around this event. And we would be particularly expecting to see it in the non-technical jobs where the minimum wage would be likely to bind, but we don't see anything. And then more formally, we do a set of tests. We also look to see if there's any evidence in those states where there's a lot of telecommutable jobs, so jobs that can be done remotely, whether there's a larger response there. And we don't find anything. So from this, we infer that it's not obvious that there's much substitution between online and offline. So let me recap what we learned. What we learned from our model estimates is really 3 things about demand. Buyers do view the workers as differentiated, which allows applicants to charge a markup. The buyers are very heterogeneous, and experience really matters for how much value they create on the platform. And whether they become experienced depends on the wage bids they've received. Those three things about buyers allow us to kind of answer our three initial questions, which were, first of all, surplus is created on the platform, and a third of it goes to workers. So quite a lot of it is going to those workers that are hired. Imposing things that raise the hiring cost to buyers early on discourages them learning that they like the platform and post fewer jobs in the future, so surplus would fall. And that it doesn't appear that the surplus that is created in this platform under the current regime is coming at the expense of surplus that's being lost offline, because buyers don't really seem to substitute. Well, we haven't found any evidence that buyers obviously substitute between offline and online employment. And when we look at what the buyers are doing, they sort of continue to post these task-based, very diverse type of activities that are perhaps not well suited to gig work in this kind of platform. I'm going to wrap up there with leaving little time for Q&A. I'm very sorry about it. Please do email me if there are questions coming. Yeah, happy to take any questions now if anyone has any time.
Great, thank you, Catherine. So I've gotten a couple questions. So the first one is, do you think that this is a feature of online labor markets that would maybe not apply offline, or do you think maybe there's some difference in the competitiveness of online versus offline behavior that would make this different? Because it does, it seems like these sort of regulations exist offline as well. And, do you think that those are bidding away all of, those are taking away all this worker surplus as well? Or is it something unique to online labor markets that mean that?
I think this characteristic of the task-based gig work is so different that it's enabling this value creating opportunity where really both sides of the market are able to benefit from it. I don't know, we did do something of sort of benchmarking our markups to labor share in a lot of the work that's being done now, particularly in the US economy, about looking at changes in the labor share. And I think we get numbers that aren't too different. We've got a few things commenting on that in the paper, but just a very different type of labor market, I think.
Thank you. And given the changing dynamics in the job market over the past decade, how would you expect these results to change if you analyze data from we would
love to do that. Yeah, our data is quite old, right? It's from 2008 to 2010. And it is true that the market that we studied is growing very fast at that time, as it still is, I believe. But I think that it's still overall such a small share of buyers and such a small share of overall employment that there is still lots of opportunity for this sort of learning how it works for you as a buyer is still very prevalent in how people interact with it today. But that would be my guess. And maybe some of the people in the audience will have a better idea than me of that. But I to the extent that not everyone has tried these markets, I think that there's still a lot of scope for this, figuring out if it's a good fit for you or not.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for presenting this very interesting paper. Oh yeah, I could provide a link to the paper. Maybe would you be able to send a link? Actually, I mean, we can also send out a link into the chat. But maybe if you have a public link.
Yeah, let me do that. I'll find the best online link and then send it to you. I think both Chris and I have it on our website somewhere. I just checked we've got the most recent version there.
Great. All right, so we'll post that on the site.
Okay.
Afterwards. So yeah, thank you so much for presenting. Thank you all for coming. And next week, September 27th, we have some presentations from some people from Accenture on the art of AI maturity, how smart machines help researchers uncover the future of smart machines. So that we can look forward to next week. Thank you so much, Catherine. And
Thank you. If I could stay on for a few minutes to make sure I get all the questions in the chat, that would be really helpful. I don't know who's in charge of the Zoom link, but I'll try and
It's me. I can stay on for a couple more.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks,
And
Catherine.
drop me a line if you want to discuss more.
So the other question I saw was, does platform rank applicants based on
Yeah,
reputation?
at the time of our data, it didn't. I think my understanding was that it was whoever sent in the application first showed up
Arrival
first
time.
in the search results. I think there's been a lot of work done now about curating those search results a little bit better to try and improve the fit. Precisely along the lines that this question suggests, that there is scope for
right, being the top applicant in the pile is very useful. I thought it was interesting that actually, would you go, you had these results on application rank, and it seemed like workers get more surplus if they're in the first 10 applications.
Yeah.
Are they, do you know if that's like statistically significantly difference? Is it a, is it a rounding?
Yeah, we got a couple of slides because it is, in some audiences it's surprising that these markups are so large. I mean, we have markups of about 24%, and we say, well, where does the market power come from? And so we've included applicant order as one of the observable characteristics of each application. And so we have precise estimates on how much that matters, whether you're on the first page, which is applicants 1 to 10, the second page, 11 to 20. And yeah, they're different from they're significantly different from each other. And even though the early applicants are actually charging higher markups as well, they're still more likely to be high.
Even though their wages are including that. Wow.
I'm just trying to download what the pictures that John sent.
I think they're the same photo.
Yeah, I actually put them up twice. I first thought I could just drag it, and then apparently I could. So I posted it twice. Yeah, Catherine, it's a plot showing the decline of job posting over time after the market-wide imposition. Exactly what.
Oh, really?
Predicting. Yep.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay. So that's yeah. I'm sorry I went over so briefly.
No. It was great. Yeah. So I have a new version of the paper that uses the categories of work that actually had wages that were below the minimum, and using as a comparison those categories that had relatively high wages, and you see this very clear reduction in job posting going forward.
Okay. So that's actually very. Very consistent, right?
It's very consistent and very clear in the data. It screened out a whole bunch of work.
That's really interesting. Okay, well, we will be sure to take a close look at that. Thank you.
If you email me, I'll send you the latest version. I finally got off my butt and revised the paper. So
I'll do that. Okay, great. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah. Timing is always an issue, but thanks for your time. Thanks for your attention.
It was perfectly fine. Very much appreciate your joining us and starting the semester off with a bang.
Okay, thanks. Enjoy the rest of the semester.
Thanks. Thanks, Emma. Well done.